I mean, when we speak about the 3 garments, I think we're up to 122. Does that sound right?
At the very bottom of the page where it says, can
Right.
holiness be attained?
Mm-hmm. Right. And we were speaking about the definition of holiness and how holiness is defined by God only. And if there's something that we may think is holy, but God did not define as holy, so it's simply not holy. Because again, holiness is a domain of the holy, the domain of the divine. And therefore, I think we gave the example of Mount Sinai. Therefore, Mount Sinai, although it's a very special place, and it's a place where great holiness happened, but the mountain itself is not holy. Why? Because God did not call it holy. So it is with places, so it is with people, so it is with days. There are days in the Jewish calendar that are holy. Why? Because God called them holy. Why is Passover a holiday? We even call it in English holy day. Why? Because God called it holy. We can't just decide, oh, tomorrow is the holy day because we feel like it. It might be as holy as we may think it is, but God did not call it holy. It's not holy. That's the definition of holiness. Now, we were saying this in the context, and then we'll get right to it. We were saying this in the context of, if we want to become holy, then we have to connect to the things that God made holy. There are 613 commandments that God made holy. He made them holy commandments. So by doing a mitzvah, we become holy. We engage with holiness that makes us holy. Now, we can pick any commandment, and the more, of course, the better. But every mitzvah that we do is really a meeting with holiness, so to speak. And that's when we are completely immersed in it and engaged in it, becomes a part of us. That's the idea. Why do we speak about the 630 mitzvot? Because not just because we're speaking about holiness, but we're speaking about that's the language of those garments, so to speak. Thought, speech, and action, which are the garments of the soul, if you recall, right? The levushim. How do they express themselves? Through mitzvot. When a person thinks a mitzvah, when a person says words that are words of mitzvah, and when a person, most importantly, does actions that are mitzvot, then he can make his thought, speech, and action holy, and they become one with God, one with holiness. That's the general idea. That's where we're up to. That's the summary. Now let's continue at the bottom of page 122. Again with this topic of holiness. Holiness being, once more, what God chose as holy. Anything that man chooses as holy, if God did not choose it, it's not holy. So let's continue. Does anyone want to read? Bottom of page 122.
Rabbi, if even if it's not holy, if it's a good action, it still should be done.
That's a good point. You're right. There's a difference between the world of holiness and the world of goodness. Now, most instances, they're together, right? Holiness equals goodness and goodness equals holiness. There are instances where holiness does not necessarily equal goodness, but that doesn't mean that goodness mustn't be done. Goodness. Now, I'll say something else also, that a lot of people want to engage in holiness because they want to be holy. And it's a very selfish motive, right? So, you're doing this holy act to become holy, so it's for you. You're not doing it for God. And that's one of the dangers of holiness. But although it is a commandment, right? I'm reminded of the commandment in Leviticus, Kedoshim tiyu ki kadosh ani, be holy because I am holy. So we need to be holy. And that motive, as selfish as it may be, should not stop us from being holy, from acting holy. But goodness, I think, is less ego-centered. When you do good, some people do good also for selfish reasons. But doing good does not have that layer, it's going to make you holy. So it's less tempting to the ego. And when goodness and holiness are not necessarily coinciding, one should do good just in order to do good. And in a way, by being that selfless, that is what will make him holy. Because then he becomes a channel of God. God, the source of all holiness, and flows through him. You're serving your ego. So I'm saying, The world of holiness and goodness are two separate worlds at times, not a lot, but at times. But you can still make that connection between goodness and holiness when you choose to do good just for good reasons. When you choose to do good, that's when a connection happens between those two worlds, because then holiness flows through you. You become a channel for holiness, a channel for the divine. And then you connect goodness with holiness. Even though they may have been separated to begin with, but because of your selflessness, now they're one.
Most people would say a mitzvah is a good deed, but in fact, a mitzvah is a commandment.
Right, right. It's a commandment. It comes from the word tzivuy, right? Commandment. And on a deeper level, it also comes from the word tzevet, which means connection. And that's because when you do a mitzvah, you connect to God. You connect to the commander of the mitzvah. And that's then you become one with God. Right. That's the power, I think, of mitzvahs, that it's not just, we've been speaking about this, it's not just doing nice things, but it's really becoming one with God, and it's unifying not just ourselves with God, but the world with God. And when enough mitzvahs will be done, that's when Mashiach will be coming. Why? Because the world will have been so elevated. Every part of the world will have been made holy, will have become one with God, will have had that tzevet impact. And the world will be filled with divinity, ready for the next level. That's
Rabbi,
If that's the case, I think it's going to be a long time.
but we're like dwarfs on giants' shoulders. I think.
Although sometimes I hear rabbis saying they hear footsteps, but I don't hear the footsteps.
Neither do I. But it's a question of faith, and I think that the generations before have really worked very hard. But that's why Maimonides says that we should never underestimate the power of one mitzvah, because it could tip the scale. There's so many mitzvahs that have been accumulated throughout the generations that now maybe just one more mitzvah will tip the scale and bring that usher in that era of redemption that will come again by unifying this world through mitzvahs with God himself. Yeah. Yes, Linda.
so when last week when your dad was giving his talk, and you talked about lighting that your mother lights a candle for you, that you should be a light in the world. Well, I thought that was a beautiful mitzvah kind of thing to do. So I did it for my children on Friday night, and then I sent them a picture and told them why. So,
Nice.
so what I think, I watched your face when you said, my mother does this for me because she thinks that I am. And I thought, what a lovely way to help your children step up is by telling them that they already are there.
Right.
Which is what your mother does for you. She tells you you're already there.
Right.
And so that's speaking about mitzvahs, I think that what she's done over the years is a beautiful mitzvah, and so I adopted it. So thank you and your dad and your mom for that.
You know that you did that for your children. You should continue every Friday.
I will.
Really beautiful. But I think that's the power of mitzvah. That's one of the expressions of power of mitzvah. It's not just doing something nice, but it really has a ripple effect on children, on the world altogether. We were speaking about how one of the reasons people light Shabbat candles is to represent the light that they are in the world, and therefore when they have children, mothers light one candle per child, in addition to the candles that they're already lighting, again, to represent that every child of theirs is a light in the world. And I don't think there's anything more encouraging, more reassuring for children growing up, knowing that their mother lights that represents them. You might be in your darkest hour, but your mother's light shines through. And you say, no, that doesn't define me. Rather, that light that she lights every week defines me. And it's a beautiful thing. It really is a beautiful thing.
It is. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
But it also goes to remind us that really people, I think when you demonstrate to people that you think they're up here, they move that way.
Right.
And So in anyone, children or anyone, you know, and you've said that many times, is
Mhm.
make the assumption of good and people will move towards it.
Right.
So that's just another expression of that.
Yeah. Very good. That's right. Okay, so that's the power of mitzvahs, absolutely. And in a way, they make us holy because God called mitzvahs holy. All right, so let's continue here. Bottom of page 122, still in the theme of holiness, of what holiness that is defined by God alone, not by man, as we just explained. So who wants to continue to read? Anyone? Bottom of page 1.
Happy to read.
Thank you.
Can holiness be attained in some other way? Is it possible to create new types of holiness other than through Torah and mitzvot? We have a letter from the author of Tanya printed in some Chabad prayer books regarding certain Hasidic groups who, in order to stimulate their souls to prayer, would sit around telling jokes so as to raise their spirits before approaching their prayers. The author sharply condemned this practice, referring to it as a mitzvah that comes through a sin, the joy of those who are, quote, extremely evil and sinful against God, end quote, and similar expressions. Holiness cannot be manufactured by man. Holiness means relationship with God, the infinite, Ein Sof. But finite man cannot, by his own power, relate to the infinite, as neither he nor anything he generates can be of intrinsic significance to the infinite. People tend to relate things they have created to God and then expect him to regard them as holy. The human being might create something that is very important, very great, very inspiring. That creation might even represent a great sacrifice on his part, in the sense that he has devoted his time and his very self to it. But none of this makes it in any way connected with the infinite. Between the infinite and the finite is an infinite gap. Between the infinite and man is a gap that man cannot bridge. However high a man rises, whatever effort he makes, the gap between him and the divine remains. From his side, the gap cannot be closed.
Right, which is, again, a very powerful statement, because what it says is that no matter how hard we try, and some people try very hard, some individuals try very hard, I think some cultures try very hard to be as divine as they can be, as holy as they can be. But as long as they are doing it within the framework of humanity, of themselves, of their being finite, as Rabbi Stein says here, then they'll never be able, however much they stretch that finite to trying to approach infinity, as again, as much as they try, as much as they strive, still infinity and infinity or finite and infinite have a huge gap between them. So even if you are the best of the humans, you'll never be able to be godly, because there's that gap between the finite and infinite. So how do you become godly? By doing that which God wants you to do. That's how you bridge the gap. So you can be as creative as you want. You can be as sacrificing as you want. You can be as fluffy as you want, but it won't help making you divine, making you holy. Because again, you'll always have that bridge. The only thing that will help is a mitzvah. There's a parable in the work of Chassidus about a king who sits in his palace and he's lofty and he's above all. And all of a sudden, he turns to some simpleton and he says to him, "Can you bring me a cup of water?" Now, the simpleton, before that commandment of the king, had no connection with the king. He may have dreamt to be a king. He may have dreamt to even have a meeting with the king, but there was no connection whatsoever. He was a simpleton and the king was a king. But the second the king told him, "Bring me a cup of water," a simple commandment. There's nothing like, he didn't tell him, "Become my right-hand man." Didn't tell him, "Come be my ambassador to Finland," or whatever it is. He told him, "Bring me a cup of water." But that commandment itself then created a connection. Now the king needs the simpleton, and the simpleton is connected to the king. And that in and of itself, that simple commandment now is what created that link between that infinite king, so to speak, and the finite simpleton. Same year. The simpleton can do all sorts of things. He can go and send letters to the king as much as he wants. He can do art pieces for He can do a lot of things, but if the king is not engaged, the king is not engaged. But the second the king says, give me a cup of water, that connection happens. And when the simpleton engages in that act, then he's connected to the deepest desire of the king. He wants water. He's connected to the king like nothing else could connect them. Same here. That's exactly what mitzvahs do. A mitzvah is that ability to connect to God because God says, I want this. Mitzvahs represent God's desire. So when we do a mitzvah, we are finally bridging that gap between the finite and infinite. As hard as we tried, we could have sent letters to God. We could have created art pieces for God. We could have done all sorts of things for God. But if that's not part of God's desire, and at least God didn't tell us that it's part of his desire, fine. So the finite remains finite and the infinite is infinite. But the second we bring a cup of water, so to speak, for God, we do that mitzvah, that's when that gap is bridged. So therefore, I do want to just point out, therefore, anything, that we try, I remember, and I don't think we've mentioned this, anything that we try to do in order to stimulate our spiritual desires, like these Hasidim would try to do, to tell jokes before prayer, to try and stimulate, that's not a holy thing. And that's why he condemned them. Why? Because that's human beings trying to be holy without necessarily involving God. They're involving their own emotions. And it's got nothing to do with God's commandment. God didn't command them to do jokes before prayer. I will say, by the way, as a side note, that before studying Torah in the Talmud, Rabbah would tell jokes and then to his students, and then he would teach them Torah. Why? Because he would say that this would open up their spirits. Once you tell a joke, you connect to the crowd, and then they can study better. So, but the act of the joke itself is not holy. It's a preparation maybe for holiness. But that in of itself is not holy. And they, the Hasidim, not relate to this as holy again because it's man-made. It's not God-made. And as lofty and as opening as you may think this may be spiritually, it's still not holy because God did not command. It doesn't bridge that gap. What I was going to say is that I think that in a way this sounds maybe discouraging because we may think that, oh, I'm engaged in this and I'm engaged in that. And I thought this to be so spiritual and so holy, and it's not based on this. But on the other hand, I think it's very encouraging because this, and this is one of the revolutions, dare I say, that the Tanya brought to the world, the Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi brought to the world. Because what he did is that he brought the notion of holiness to everyone, to the masses. Up until he came, people said, oh, you can only be holy if you've achieved A, B, and C, if you're a great scholar, and if you meditated on holiness for 10 years, and if you're behaving, if your way of life is follows this pattern, then you can be holy. And yeah, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi says, no, you're wrong. Holiness belongs to everyone. If you do a mitzvah, you might be the worst guy in the world. You did a mitzvah, you became holy. One of the examples that the Lubavitcher Rebbe brings about this, how anyone can become holy, even the worst of the worst, is he brings the example, I know he said this in a private audience to a great rabbi who was really flabbergasted by this notion that, what, are you telling me criminals can become holy? Yes, they could. They do a mitzvah, they bring that cup of water for God, they become holy. That's an unbelievable, think about this. It's a transformational thought. But also is that criminals, even as worse as they can be, always have this pathway to God. But the example that was brought by Lubavitcher Rebbe, it's just a powerful example that demonstrates this. And that is that, say someone in the times of the temple, because that's when we had that tribunal of judges who could condemn the person and sentence them even to death. Say someone was condemned as a murderer by this Sanhedrin, and he was sentenced to death. Now he's being led to his death. And this is according to Jewish law. Now he says, you know what, before you kill me, I want a cup of water. You have to give him a cup of water. You bring him a cup of water. The halachic question is this: does he have to say the blessing over the water? Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam she'akol niya b'dvaro, or not? The guy's a criminal. The guy's being sentenced to death. He's going to be killed by the Sanhedrin in just a few moments. Does he have to say a blessing? He lost his connection with God. And the halacha is, he does. He does have to say a blessing. That even at his lowest point, he can still have that connection with God. The blessing is asher, it's a mitzvah. God wants you to say a blessing over a cup of water. So he can still connect to God even at his lowest point. It reminds me of the midrash of Menashe. Menashe was one of the most evil kings in the history of the Jewish people, some 2,800 years ago, less, something like that. And he murdered his own grandfather. He brought idol worship to the land of Israel. Was a mass murderer too. And when he died, the Midrash says that the angels formed a wall to block his entry, not just to paradise, but to God. And Menashe, apparently, just before he died, he did teshuvah. He repented. Now the angels are saying, we don't care about your teshuvah. We don't care about your return. You're not going anywhere. You're that evil king. But God saw his sincerity. God saw his desire to connect to him through teshuvah, which is yet another mitzvah. So what did he do? He dug a tunnel underneath the angels, and he said to Menashe, come through this tunnel and reach me. He bypassed the angels, almost like a Hamas tunnel, but he was able to bypass them and then reach God. The power of repentance, the power of teshuvah. But it's also the power of what we're speaking about. That holiness is the domain of all, without exception. You don't have to be in a yeshiva for 20 years, like it was in the times of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi, the author of Tanya, and then know A, B, and C, and the Talmud off by heart, and the Code of Jewish Law off by heart, and then you'll be considered, no, do a mitzvah and you're holy. So as discouraging as it may sound, it's also as encouraging as could be, because any one of us can be holy at any given moment. Say a blessing over water, even if you're the lowliest murderer, become holy.
Rabbi?
Will holiness last? I don't know, but still.
Rabbi, you remind me of a joke.
Ooh.
There's 3 people sentenced to death. A Frenchman, an Italian, and a Jew.
Yeah.
And they say to them, we're going to give you one last meal before you are executed. So the Frenchman says, okay, I'll have French pastry. They give him the pastry, then they execute him. The Italian says, I'd like lasagna. So they give him lasagna and then they execute him. And they come to the Jew and he says, I would like strawberries. But they tell him, yeah, but it's winter time. It's not the season for it. He says, I'll wait.
Very clever. That's right.
That's a good one.
Delay it. Maybe that act of holiness, really, I mean, it's connected, because maybe that act of holiness will delay it. And now the other side to it, which I was going to add, which is also very encouraging, discouraging again, because it's like Rabbi Steinsaltz calls it, and Jordan can relate to this, and we've mentioned this in the past, but he calls it that a lot of people are engaged in false pregnancies, right? A false pregnancy, and Jordan, you can explain this better, but I believe is when a woman thinks she's pregnant, and she has all the signs and the symptoms that she's pregnant, but she's not. And same year, people think they're connected to God because they did all sorts of things, but again, are man-made. The mitzvah is not what they did. They did all sorts of things that they imagined will bring them closer to God. So they're experiencing this false pregnancy. Am I being accurate, Jordan?
Yep, pseudosciasis.
Pseudosciasis. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's true in the spiritual area where you think you're pregnant, but you're not. And so it's discouraging because automatically it annuls all sorts of things that we may think may bring us to God. But on that, it's super encouraging. Because again, number one, holiness is the domain of all. And number two, I want to add, and I'll share with you a secret. That's why I'm in the business I'm in. Frankly, that's because I believe in the power of mitzvahs. And I believe, and I've seen this time and time again, as I'm sure you have, that when a person does a mitzvah, and because of that mitzvah, as we are explaining here, he came in contact with the divine. He became holy. He has now holiness in his life. The power of that mitzvah is never to be underestimated because I've seen it time and time again that it transforms people. People say, oh, you really, I'm going to put the tefillin now. Really, I'm going to light Shabbat candles. Really, I'm going to do that mezuzah. Fine, I'll do it just for you. And then they do it, and something magical happens. Their whole life is transformed, and they don't understand where it came from. And they say, oh, wow, I thought I was doing just a little detail just to please the rabbi, and it changed my life. But I didn't change their lives. They didn't change their lives. You know what changed their lives? The divine changed their lives. The divine that they came in contact with. The holiness that mitzvah brought to their lives. That created a ripple effect that even the greatest of prophets sometimes cannot see. And that's the other side of what we're speaking about here, of how just doing mitzvahs and that connection with God creates a transformational impact on people's lives.
But Rabbi, a question about what Rabbi Steinsaltz writes here. He says, but none of this makes it in any way connected with the infinite. And he's talking about these inspiring things that one may do, maybe a great sacrifice on their part, devotes his time to it. So does this mean things that are outside of Torah, outside of mitzvot?
Yeah, absolutely. I would call it in general jargon, and I don't even know what that word means, but I would call it voodoo. A lot of voodoo that people do. I think that's what he's referring to, but I also think it could very well be that, you have all sorts of cultures. Like I want to take it maybe in different directions. So let's speak about a delicate topic, but a topic that needs to be spoken about. Shaheeds. Terrorists to think that if they blow themselves up, they'll be shaheeds, holy. Mm-hmm. And they'll have a paradise with 72 virgins. Did God command that? Obviously not. But in their mind, that's going to make them holy. But again, it's the greatest distortion to the notion of holiness. So you have an extreme example right there. But you also have small examples of people in their own lives saying, you know what? Again, and we've used that example. Today I need to go and hike and meditate on top of Camelback for 5 hours. And it's going to bring me tremendous holiness. I'm going to feel divine. Maybe that's not what you need to do today. Maybe there's a person that is waiting for your call and you should stay at home and call that person and be on the phone with them for an hour, even if that's what it demands. That's what's going to make you holy. So you have all this false pregnancy of being up on the mountain, but even I think it speaks of that small example rather than the big extreme example of the shaheed. So I think you find that in almost all departments of life. But I will say this, so how do you know? First, you know because of the mitzvah. Are you doing a mitzvah? You're not doing a mitzvah. Meditating on a mountain, as holy as it may sound, may not be a mitzvah. I think in some cases it could be a mitzvah. But it's not God didn't tell you go meditate on the mountain. He did say, pray. So that's a mitzvah. If you pray in that state of, but again, if it comes instead of other mitzvahs, maybe you're just doing it for yourself and then it's nothing to do with the king, with the infinite. But I will say this, I think another tool that can be used to ask ourselves, am I really now engaging in this false pregnancy or am I connecting to God, is by asking yourself whether through this action, are you going to be more you or are you going to be less you? And I'm reminded, but that's one of the reasons we have on a deeper level, but that's one of the reasons we have salt on our tables and we dip our bread in the salt. We dip our bread in the salt. The reason we do that, and I'm sure you've seen that a lot, but that's because our tables on which we eat are like sacrifice, are like the altar of the temple. We relate to every table on which we eat as the altar of the temple. Why is it like the altar? Because we hope that the food that is brought on our table is used as a sacrifice too, like the food that was brought on the table of the altar. How can the food that we eat be used as a sacrifice? When we eat the food and we use it for God, so we've really taken the food and sacrificed it to God. We've channeled its energy, the energy that it gave us, to God. So when we eat food and do a mitzvah with it, that's the same as taking an animal and bringing it to God, because we brought that food to God. And that's why every table ought to remind us of not just an altar, but of our duty to take all the food that we consume and use that energy of the food for God. But on the altar, there was salt. And therefore, on every table that we eat, there should be salt. To remind us again that every table is an altar, and that the act of eating can become a mitzvah in and of itself by using the food for God himself afterwards, or the energy the food gives us. Now, why salt? Why not paprika? Why not pepper? Why? I mean, I can think of other spices that would certainly embellish the taste of the sacrifices and of our food. I mean, use some za'atar. I don't know if you're familiar with the Israeli Arabic spice of za'atar. You find it in hummus a lot. Use that. Why not? Why not something a little more than salt? And the answer is because that's when you know whether you are connecting with God or not, whether you're using salt or other spices. What's the difference between salt and other spices? All other spices alter the taste of the food. They change the taste. Salt doesn't. What does salt do? It enhances what already is there. It enhances the taste that is already in the food. That's why people put salt on watermelon, on ice cream, on chocolate, because it enhances the taste of the chocolate or the watermelon, whatever it may be. Now, that's a real sacrifice. Real sacrifice is when you become more you, when your soul becomes even more expressive, when your soul is allowed to demonstrate itself even more. That's a real sacrifice, when you become more you. When you become less you, Shahid is a good example, but there's so many other examples. You become less you, then it's not, then you're using spices. Then it's not a real sacrifice. That's not the sacrifice that God wants. That changes you. And in a way, I think that's another tool. Not just asking yourself whether I'm doing a mitzvah now, is this part of the 613 commandments that I'm engaging with or not? But also asking yourself, well, where am I here? Is this going to make me more divine, more me? Is it in line completely with my unique purpose in life? Or is it making me less me? And I think that's another compass to use when we ask ourselves that question of whether we're bridging the gap, like he speaks about here, between the infinite and the finite. Okay, any other comments, questions? We can continue otherwise, but should be a two-way street. Yes, Amy, please. Or Linda.
Amy can go.
Amy and then Linda, fine.
Rabbi, isn't there another compass of defining whether or not it's truly a mitzvah by saying or asking oneself, is this inconvenient for me? So the act becomes even more holy if you stop your life to do it for somebody else and it's just not convenient, but you want to do it and you need to do it. Is that a determinant?
It's a good question. According to Jewish law, no. And I say this because it doesn't matter the motive of a mitzvah when you do a mitzvah, really. I mean, like we've said, I think in the past, but if I'm walking in the street and $1 falls out of my pocket and a poor person finds it, I fulfill the mitzvah of tzedakah. I had no intention of giving tzedakah whatsoever. But a poor person find my $1 and eventually it bought a piece of bread for him, I fulfilled the mitzvah of tzedakah. So the intention does not count for 99% of the mitzvahs. Intention doesn't count. I mean, there are mitzvahs where you have to have intention, otherwise, intention-based mitzvahs. But now, does it help enhance the impact of the mitzvah on you, on your life, if you have a good intention, or if you have, more importantly, a selfless intention? Yeah, absolutely. But for the connection itself with God, then it really makes no difference. Again, that simpleton that's bringing a cup of water to the king, like the example that we brought. Whether he wants to bring the cup of water, doesn't want to bring the cup of water, brings it with a smile, without a smile, the king will have his water, and that will nurture him no matter what. So it's not, it doesn't make a difference. The connection is the connection. I will say this, I think that, you know, I have a dear friend, Rabbi Yossi Jacobson, that spoke with us. Just one second, yes. Hi, good. Please, go ahead, thank you. Okay, carpet cleaning is here in Shul. Which connects
With
beautifully
masks?
to the question you asked, because sometimes we have to do some ego cleaning too. So that's important. But I will say this, that speaking of ego cleaning, so Yossi Jacobson, who was with us a few weeks ago, really gave a brilliant talk. If you haven't seen it, it's on our website and on our YouTube channel. But I remember him asking Rabbi Steinsaltz one day, he said, he's a lecturer, right? That's what he does, and he's brilliant at it. And he once asked Rabbi Steinsaltz, you know, maybe I should stop doing this because I feel that it's boosting my ego. Each time I give a good lecture and people are tapping me on my shoulders, my ego is swelling. Should I stop? And Rabbi Steinsaltz says, and who cares about your ego? Are you inspiring these people? Are you teaching them Torah? Continue and let your ego be checked somewhere else. But as long as you're doing a mitzvah, you're doing a mitzvah. And I think that should, not only that, it should never stop us from, right? Even though we might not have a selfless intention, a mitzvah needs to be done. Again, going back to Rabbi Steinsaltz, I once asked him, why do you do what you do? He says, because no one else does it. So I do what I do. If a mitzvah needs to be done, no one else is doing it, do it. And if there's a selfish motive, let it be. It shouldn't stop you. Now, it might eventually have less of an impact, that mitzvah, on you, and it might cause all sorts of ego swellings. So then you have to deal with it in other ways. But the mitzvah needs to be done, and the mitzvah and therefore the mitzvah should be done. And that's, again, according to Jewish law. We've never looked at motives. We're a do-good religion, not a feel-good one. Doesn't matter how you feel. The deed is what counts. In the words of the sages. The deed is the most important thing. Now, that's where Chassidus comes into place. That's where Kabbalah comes into place. That's where the Tanya comes into place. The Kabbalah comes not just to encourage us towards doing mitzvahs, but it comes to also work on our ego and to work on all the other bad motives we may have when we do a mitzvah. But I do believe also, just to add another layer to this, that the more we do mitzvahs, the more that power of holiness that we spoke about, that connection with the divine, will take care of our ego too. I think Oscar Schindler is a good example. We've used him. He was the not a good man, but the more he did mitzvahs, the more his ego was put into check, and the more selfless he became, to the point that he was penniless after the war because he gave his entire fortune to save Jews. So the more you do mitzvahs, the more you don't need to go to therapy for your ego often. All you need to do is do even more mitzvahs. And that will take care of your ego. So Yossi Jacobson today has given thousands of more lectures ever since he spoke to Rabbi Steinsaltz. And knowing him, I think now he's a little less ego-centered. Why? Did he go to therapy? No, not that I know of. Because again, his mind was changed into purpose-oriented, God-oriented. I'm going to do this with my ego, without my ego. And then in of itself has an impact on the ego eventually, and minimizes the swell of it and the negative motives that one may have or may have had at the beginning. A good question. Yeah. Now that doesn't mean that, you know, that you have to be selfish and that when you give tzedakah, you should have your name everywhere, and, you know, which is sometimes good, by the way. Don't get me wrong, because then it encourages other people. If he gave, I should give. So that's fine. But I'm saying, doesn't mean that you shouldn't work on your ego. It does. And I think that you know, there's tools to deal with the egos that are mentioned in, again, Hasidic thought in Kabbalah. But I will say this, I think what it does mean is that just what comes to mind, you know, the word for ego in Hebrew is enochi. That's the word that is used. Enochi is enochiyut. That's how they would call it in modern Hebrew. And it's interesting to note because anochi or enochi is also the first word of the Ten Commandments. And the first word of the Ten Commandments, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am God, your Lord. And I think one of the ways to deal with the ego is not to obliterate the ego. Very many people beat themselves down. They say, oh, we're too arrogant, let's speak about ourselves negatively, and let's find all these negative traits that we have that will remind us that we're not as big as we are. I think that's not the Jewish way to deal with the ego. The Jewish way to deal with the ego is that an ego might be a good thing. It just needs to be, that Enochi is really rooted in the first Enochi, in God's eye. You just need now to align your eye with his eye. Make sure that everything that you find in that ego is then aligned with God. Don't obliterate it, but make sure that it's aligned with the purpose that God gave you. So use your ego in order to give those speeches, Rabbi Jacobson. Use your ego in order to give tzedakah. And the more you align your Enochi with that Enochi, those Enochis blend together and become one. Very often when people engage in the obliteration of the ego, then they are not just obliterating the ego, but they're obliterating all the mitzvahs that they did because of the ego, because now they're nothing. So who are they to do something? And that's certainly not a method. There's a reason why Enochi, the word for ego, is the same word as the word for God. I am God, your Lord. That's because God doesn't want us to get rid of our ego. He just wants us to align it with that purpose. So if I'm using my ego, again, to give speeches, to do tzedakah, and I align it more and more with God's eye, then my ego now is shaped into a divine ego. Ego is not a source of bad. It can just be channeled for good. And then it becomes one with God. Our Enochis blend together. That's another thing to remember while dealing with egotistic motives.